Now let's look at what happens after we've gotten the data from the database. And I've folded up some code here inside get from database and render, so we don't see the introductory code where we're putting the parameters into local variables, and we don't see that switch statement where I go through the various cases of my picks, popular picks, and so forth. Beyond that, all I do is I call the paginate function with information that I've gotten from the database. Browse results is filled with the result of the query. It's passed in, and then I have some of the other variables, including a lot of the pagination functions and variables that are passed through, and I call paginate, and I'm passing in formatted results, which at the moment is an empty string. It will be added on to as a result of the pagination routine, and then it will be returned, and that's the result of get from database and render. So let's take a look and see what paginate does. And the structure here is a very common one, and it allows you to compartmentalize the processing of the data. We've already compartmentalized the access of the database. We compartmentalize the pagination inside the paginate routine, and we're going to do it even further. So what happens inside paginate? And I've folded up some code here, which is in fact the pagination code, so that we can look just at the guts of this function. And the guts of the function uses MySQL fetch to go into DB results, which is this parameter here, which was set to browse results, which is the result of MySQL query. And while I can still fetch row after row after row, for each row I am calling a user function which is in the variable render1. Now bear with me as I fish this through, because this is part of the compartmentalization. In calling paginate, I'm passing in the data that I got from the database and some other variables. This is the string that it's going to be added to, and here is all some pagination information. And I'm passing in a string, which is the name of the function that I want to call from paginate. In fact, the function that I want to call is called render1, and it's put into a variable called render1, but it could be another name. So I'm giving it a string here, it's passed in this variable, and I am calling a variable with whatever string was passed in here, and that function is render1. So I'm able to have, I could have a condition here based on one thing or another. I could go to a different rendering routine to process the code differently. I could use the same database access and then choose a different route for rendering. Inside pagination, I call render1, and render1 primarily calls another function called render1 columns. And what this does is it takes the data that has been passed into it and it formats it in whatever number of columns are required. You can see the first parameter here is the number of columns. Now the reason I've structured it this way is that render1 is what's going to drive the actual final formatting into columns. And it can have in it some code here that modifies the data. So for example, in the results array we have address 1 and we may have a value for address 2. Both of those are fields in the database. And if I want to, I can here construct a local variable called the address, which has munged those two fields together. So what I'm sending into render1 columns is the number of columns that I want to use, and I am sending in direct results from the database, and these are the field names in the database, but I can also, as I showed you, manipulate those so that in one case, instead of looking at the results that came out of the database, in this particular case I'm passing in the address that I constructed here out of two database fields. So this structuring of keeping the database access separate and keeping the columnarization separate from the pagination and separate from the intermediate munging of data, this gives you the most stable and efficient way of processing data in an environment where you can make changes without breaking anything. So this is the overall structure of how it's going to work. Let's now continue drilling down and looking inside the code.